It's a great honor to welcome once again to this program, Holly Ordway from the Word on Fire Institute. The last time she was on this show, we talked about her wonderful spiritual biography of J.R.R. Tolkien, and now we are discussing another great English Catholic literary figure, the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, also a great Jesuit priest. She compiled and edited a great collection of his poems titled As Kingfishers Catch Fire, selected and annotated poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins. Holly, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so I was introduced to the works of Hopkins, thankfully, from the great Thomas Merton, Trappist monk. And I wondered to the extent that you are familiar with the verse poetic works of Merton, what do you see are the similarities and differences between his and Hopkins's works?
Well, to be honest, I have no knowledge whatsoever of Merton's poetry, so I can't be of any help there, I'm afraid.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. So, but nevertheless, Hopkins came out the English Catholic literary scene of the 19th and 20th centuries, and there were plenty of great figures in that era, like Chesterton, Belloc, Waugh, and of course Tolkien himself. So, tell me a bit about how and why this scene come to flourish during this time period.
Well, this is a very complex question. This is part of what's called the sort of second spring of English Catholic culture, because English Catholicism had been actually suppressed for centuries after the Reformation, very severe civil legal penalties for even being a Catholic. And then these penalties were gradually lifted, the penal times ended. So by the 1800s, Catholic life had returned to normal in the sense that individual Catholics could be part of, they could hold jobs like other people. They had restored civil rights. This took longer than you might think. But there was still a absolute sense of marginalization in the culture because several centuries of legal suppression is going to have an effect on the culture. And so English Catholics are definitely a minority in English culture. And so then around sort of the middle of the 1800s, we start seeing a revival. And this is what John Henry Newman called sort of hopefully. He saw this as a second spring, that there would be a renewal of English Catholic life after essentially the long winter of the penal times. And so that's sort of the flowering of that we see. Well, Newman, and then some of the figures that you named, like Waugh, Chesterton, Belloc. Now Hopkins is an interesting figure in this regard because he's actually earlier, really, in terms of his poetry than the later figures that we've just mentioned. So he was a contemporary of Newman's. In fact, he was received into the Catholic Church by Newman. Um, but he died, let's see, I would have to look up the dates. I have to look up the dates here. So Hopkins was born in 1844 and he died in 1889. So he did not make it into the 20th century. He died when he was only 44. And most of his poetry was unpublished at that time. And it's only his friend Robert Bridges in 1918 produced a volume of his collected poetry, slim volume, and put it out into the world. So Hopkins is an interesting figure because he wrote in this, 19th century, late Victorian world, but he emerges into the literary world in the wake of the First World War, that catastrophic event in world culture. And so we can talk more about that, but there's a very interesting sort of break in when he wrote and then when he entered into the culture. So he didn't become known as a poet until, long after his death, or
I see.
reasonably long after his death.
So, is there still any interest in Hopkins's poetry in the literary study scene today?
Oh, absolutely. He's recognized as really one of the great poets of English literature. And his reputation has sort of grown slowly. And in a sense, it's curious because he, in some ways, is a very modern poet. And he's very angular in some ways. He's coming to grips with very difficult themes, and he's doing it with sort of really interesting moves in his language. And this is the kind of thing that was very atypical of the late Victorian era when he wrote. So he didn't really fit in well with his contemporaries, but he really did speak to the post-World War generation, precisely because he's grappling with these difficult things and stretching language, and he resonates with 20th century writers. And I think, there's been several volumes of his poetry out, his complete poems from Oxford University Press. So he really has a pretty high reputation in the literary world, and very well deserved.
Mhm. Yeah. So tell me more about how his literary works differ from the zeitgeist of his time.
Well, when he's writing the sort of the late Victorian period, and this is where you get folks like in America, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and there's sort of a bit of a complacency. There's a lot of the traditional forms, there's rhyme, there's meter, but it overall it's tended to be maybe a little bit too comfortable, a little bit sentimental, sort of, a little bit sing-songy, very popular. And Hopkins is a bit edgy. He's doing some interesting things. His poetry is quite difficult to understand on first reading through. That's why I did As Kingfishers Catch Fire, to do an annotated edition to help people actually understand what's going on in these poems. So he's sort of breaking some of the expectations of what, like for instance, sonnet. He does write a lot of sonnets. What a sonnet will do. He invents words. He does creative things with rhythm and meter. So he's definitely more experimental than the people of his day, the poets of his immediate day. And in that sense, he's a little bit like, in America, we have Walt Whitman, who goes off into a kind of free verse, very, sort of reacting against that sort of late Victorian comfortableness. Now, Whitman goes into free verse. Hopkins works with verse, but I think there's a similar sense of trying to stretch the forms a little bit.
I suppose the 20th century high modernists like Eliot and Pound found a lot of inspiration in him.
Well, I'm not a specialist in those writers, so I wouldn't want to make any claims about what any one of them individually thought about Hopkins. But it has been my observation that he was appreciated by the modernists, that he's doing some things that they liked, that they built on.
Mhm. Tell me more about Cardinal Newman's role in receiving Hopkins into the Catholic Church.
Well, I mean, he didn't have a huge role. So Hopkins was a student at Oxford, came in as an Anglican because he was raised in an Anglican family. And while he was at Oxford, he became interested in what was then called Tractarianism, the Oxford movement, of which Newman was one of the leading lights. So the Oxford movement, Tractarianism, was originally a group of clergymen of the Church of England, Newman, Pusey, and some others, who felt that the Church of England needed to recover certain of its sort of Catholic roots. And so they wrote what were called tracts for the times, these little pamphlets that made the case for particular Catholic practices being recovered. And that's why it's called Tractarianism, after the Tracts for the Times. So Newman, in working through this, kept going. He kept going sort of Romeward and ended up becoming a Catholic. Others of the Tractarians, like Pusey, and he didn't. Pusey remained friends with Newman, which is a beautiful thing, but stayed in the Church of England. So this is very much in the air at the time that Hopkins is a student. And so he's thinking about, does the Catholic Church have a greater claim to being Christ Church than the Anglican Church? And he ends up being convinced. And he writes to, actually, just looking at a letter he wrote to his father, where he gives his reasons. He says, his conversion was due to various reasons, which he lists, and he notes these are not in any particular order. Simple and strictly drawn arguments, partly my own, partly others, common sense, Reading the Bible, especially the Holy Gospels, where texts like "Thou art Peter," the evasions proposed for this alone are enough to make one a Catholic, and the manifest position of St. Peter among the apostles so pursued me that at one time I thought it best to stop thinking of them. An increasing knowledge of the Catholic system, its consolations, its marvelous ideal of holiness, the faith and devotion of its children, its multiplicity, its array of saints and martyrs, its consistency and unity, its glowing prayers, the daring majesty of its claims, etc., etc. Those two etceteras are actually Hopkins's etceteras. So what he was doing, he was a very, very intelligent young man. His tutor at one of his tutors at Oxford called him the star of Balliol because he was a student at Balliol College. And so he's really looking into this. He's learning about it. He's reading the Bible. He's reading, evidently, the Tracts for the Times. He's reading other works. And this is what leads him to make this really momentous decision. It was a huge deal for him. And he corresponds a little bit with Newman, and then it is Newman who officially sacramentally receives him into the church. But I don't think that they had, particularly close connection in that sense. Interestingly, Newman recognized that Hopkins was not really suited to being an oratorian. The oratorians were the group that the religious congregation that Newman had brought to England. And it would have been, I think, quite natural that since he'd formed a connection with this extremely intelligent young man, very talented, that Newman would have wanted him to come on, join my congregation, join the oratorians. But he recognized that this really wasn't the right fit for Hopkins, and Hopkins ends up joining the Jesuits.
Mhm. Okay. And I would assume that his parents were not too happy with his decision to convert.
No, they were extremely upset. And partly this is cultural because there's a lot of bias against Catholics at this time. Partly they felt they felt he just made the wrong move, that religiously he was headed in the wrong direction. And I think also they would have been sad at basically the way that he'd sunk all of his academic hopes as far as they could see, because by becoming a Catholic, he could not then have he couldn't have a fellowship at Oxford. He couldn't have a teaching position at Oxford. So he basically sunk his own academic career as far as they could see, because he had everything lined up for him. He was a star. He would have gotten a fellowship. He would have become probably an Oxford Don, and he sank all that. And I think as parents, they would have been horrified by that, as well as feeling that their son had taken absolutely the wrong road religiously. Because I think they were quite sincere Anglicans, and so they're worried, So there's quite a severe break, and this grieved Hopkins. It was a source of great pain to him that he had this break with his family. I want to note, though, that there's a happy ending, in a sense, in that shortly before he died at only 44. He does reconcile with his parents, and so there's a renewal of that family bond. Alas, he died too soon for it to be anything lasting, but it's nice to know that they came around in the end.
Mhm. Yeah, that's wonderful. And of course, Cardinal Newman started out as an Anglican in his early life before also converting to Catholicism. So I wonder, in this time period, the 19th century, was the difference between Anglicanism and Catholicism a theological based one, or is there cultural slash class based differences mixed in also?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, it's theological. I mean, really, and it still is. I mean, the question is, what is the church, and what is the marker of the church, and does the unity of the faith center on a particular figure, the successor to St. Peter? So really, the question of papal authority is kind of the key marker. Are you in communion with the Pope or not? Do you think that is necessary, or do you think it's not? And that really is the theological question, really right at the heart of the Anglican Catholic debate, because really, the Church of England came to be when Henry VIII broke off from the authority of the Pope, when he said, no, I'll make myself the head of the church, because I want to be able to get my divorce and marry Anne Boleyn. I'm going to make myself the head of the church, and we're going to break from the authority of the Pope. So that theological question absolutely is at the heart of this debate, particularly in England, because of the history of how the Church of England came to be. And because there's this question of authority, and because the monarch is the head of, not just the head of state, but the head of the Anglican Church, that leads into a lot of these cultural questions. So for instance, for a long time, there was the question of, can a Catholic really be a patriotic Englishman, or do they have a foreign attachment? Are they really potential traitors, all of them, because they hold this guy in Rome to be their authority? And this is a real issue, and it causes real prejudice against Catholics. It's really problematic. So there is that element. And so also when you have centuries of this kind of difficulty, you've got a couple hundred years of legal and economic disability. So as a whole, Catholics do tend to be poorer and lower class than their Anglican counterparts because they've been excluded from education. They have not been permitted to send their sons to Oxford and Cambridge and the great universities because those universities set up tests. So for instance, Oxford, you had to affirm the 39 Articles, which is the Anglican Statement of Faith, which explicitly rejects key Catholic tenets. You cannot be a Catholic and affirm the 39 Articles. You really can't. And so that meant that when Oxford insisted on that for incoming students, it meant that if you were a Catholic, you couldn't go to Oxford, period. That was eventually lifted 1871, so a little bit after Hopkins's time, but it's definitely in force. So Catholics tend to be less well educated, less well off. Now, that's not the case for converts, like Newman, highly educated, Oxford education, but because culturally Catholicism was less well educated, poorer, economically disadvantaged, it was a little, there is a class factor going here as well. Like, you're going to join them, those papists, what? So there's a lot of things going on here that make this to be a big deal. I mean, it's always a big deal to change your theological position, but culturally it was a much bigger deal in England of that time than it is now, fortunately.
Yes. So tell me more about what finally convinced Hopkins to convert to Catholicism.
Well, I've just read you that quote where he gave off his reasons, and I think there you've got it. There was no, I think, one silver bullet. There was just a number of things that led him to think, right, this is the church.
Okay. And how did he become a Jesuit?
Well, I mean, he applied to enter their order to become a novice. So he was accepted into that, and then he did a number of years. They've got a long training. He did a number of years of training at their seminary in Wales, and then was ordained a priest eventually. And it's interesting because his time in Wales ends up making its way into his poetry. Because one of the things I discovered when I was doing the annotations for As Kingfishers Catch Fire is how many very specific landscape words Hopkins used. So many words that are just very, very specific about like a certain type of fern, a certain type of brook. He's very, very attentive to the natural world. And some of these words are very specific to the area in Wales where he was serving as a novice. So it's interesting, we can kind of see a direct taking up of that experience just in the landscape as well as in his theology.
He also served as a university professor both in London and in Dublin, and he had a rather unhappy time in Dublin. So tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, as a Jesuit, they're very emphasize they have a strong emphasis on education, and as Hopkins with an Oxford, education, he obviously was a good choice to be a professor. But he ended up teaching at the Catholic University in Dublin, which was not a great it was a new endeavor, and it was not getting off to a very good start. It was very underfunded, even more so than universities are always seen to be underfunded. And they had too many students and not enough professors, so Hopkins was sort of overloaded with grading. Professors can understand how depressing that can be. And he was very conscientious, but the students were so kind of under the mark in terms of their language that he was sort of burning himself out trying to help them. And then it was also a very unhealthy just sort of environment because the buildings were in disrepair. The plumbing was not very good. And so he ends up, in fact, dying of typhoid, which he would have gotten from the terrible plumbing at the university. So it was not a happy ending to his university teaching career, alas.
Yeah. So, did he struggle with balancing his vocation as a Jesuit and his literary works?
Yeah, interestingly, he did, but not because of outward pressure, but because of inward pressure. He'd written poetry as a young man, but when he entered the Jesuit order, he burned all of his early poetry on his own impulse, not because anybody told him to do that, because he felt that he really wanted to just wholeheartedly focus on his religious vocation. And I think he thought that there could be or might be or was a conflict in his focus. But interestingly, he was actually one of his Jesuit supervisors, one of his professors in Wales, who got him going again, who encouraged him to start writing poetry again when Hopkins read an account in the newspaper of the wreck of the Deutschland, which was a ship coming from Germany that had some refugee Catholic nuns. And this ends up becoming his great poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland, which is in my collection. Um, and it's actually this teacher, this priest at the seminary who encourages him, go, no, come on, draw it, do this poem. And that gets him going again. And I think that was a catalyst that helped him to see that his poetry didn't have to be in conflict with his vocation, because here we have one of his professors encouraging him to do it. And so from that time on, we see that he writes more poetry, and I think he begins to see it as complementary to his vocation rather than as a tension. So I don't think ultimately that there was a tension. I think he was just afraid. He was a very intense man. I think he was just afraid that we wouldn't be able to be single-minded. And again, he died so young, only 44. He was still, relatively young man. So if he had lived, which is such a tragedy that he died so young, if he lived, he might even have come more to terms with it, because he certainly was on that trajectory of integrating his poetry and his vocation as a priest. So I think he found an integration there. I don't think there's a real separation.
Mhm. Yeah, and I read the Wreck of the Deutschland, and it's a magnificent poem. I believe it's one of his longest, and perhaps one of his more complex ones. So before I get into that, I'd like you to talk about his final words, which you began the collection with. He said, "I am so happy. I'm so happy. I love my life." So, with all of the conflicts and tensions and all the illnesses that he encountered throughout his life, why did he say so?
Well, I mean, I think ultimately it's because he loved his Lord Jesus Christ, and that what all the things he had done, he had really put that first. He really gave his whole heart to serving God, and to following Him. And that was why he made all these sacrifices. That was why he gave up his career at Oxford. That's why he did all of this, and all the suffering that he endured trying to do the work that was given to him. Again, this is him trying to live out his vocation as a priest to which God had called him. And so I think at the end, I we don't know what that moment was like for him, obviously, but I like to think that he was hearing our Lord say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," because I think he really had given his all. as a vocationally as a priest. He had, artistically as a poet. I mean, even relationally, he had good friendships, and he even reconciled with his parents. So he's really trying to live out this faith that he has embraced. And I think at that moment of his death, he's faithful. He has no fear of what's ahead of him. He would have received the last rites because, he knew he was dying. And so I think he knew where he was headed and was not afraid and looked back and had no regrets. And that's that's really a beautiful thing, It's a beautiful thing.
That's it. Yeah. So, yeah, you've already told the story behind the poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland. And so, was it his first published poem following his ordained into the order?
Well, it wasn't actually published, which is a curious
Oh.
thing. It was accepted for publication by a Jesuit publication, but then they backed out. And I can understand why, because The Wreck of the Deutschland it's a challenging poem, and it's not typical. It's not the sort of comfortable, easy to read historical narrative that you would expect from poetry of that day. You would expect something that was a little bit less, well, a little bit more narrative, whereas The Wreck of the Deutschland gives us these sort of glimpses of scenes of the sinking ship, and sort of glimpses of the sort of spiritual meaning behind it, but they're more like images. It's a striking poem. It's a very difficult poem. Um, and so a little bit too difficult for people to quite get a hold of at that time.
Yeah. So, what would be your guide to introducing the uninitiated reader into the works of Hopkins?
Well, I would say get my edition. See, this is my edition as Kingfishers Catch Fire. And that does sound very self-promotional, but the reason I say that is that I have been reading Hopkins for 30 odd years, and I've been teaching Hopkins for a decade and a half more. Yeah, more. And realizing this is hard. I mean, I remember reading Hopkins as an undergraduate, and thinking, wow, this is amazing, and I don't understand it. Um, and then trying to teach Hopkins, again, to undergraduates, and feeling like there's so much here, but it's such hard work to get at it, especially for the modern reader, for whom many of Hopkins' language choices would have been more accessible in his day than they are now. So I set out to create a book that would make Hopkins more accessible. And so what I did, is I did a facing page annotation. So for instance, if we have, let me find one of his here's one of his, they're called terrible sonnets. Or sonnets of desolation. They're terrible because he's grappling with difficult themes, not because they're bad poetry. So here's I wake and feel the fell of dark, not day. And I've got a facing page annotation. So on the one side, I've got the poem, but on the other side, I've got notes. And you can see I wrote quite a lot of notes for this poem. And so, trying to give these additional notes to help people get into, well, what does it mean? But not cluttering up the text with lots of footnotes. So that's why I did the facing page style. So you can read the poem clean, then you can look over and look at the notes and see, oh, that's what, gall means bitterness. And then I parse out some of his sentences, some of his phrasings that are interesting syntax, into reverse order of words and things like that. So then you can see, oh, that's what he's doing. Then you can read the poem again, and you can understand more of it. So that's why I edited this book. In general, I think it's quite helpful that most of Hopkins's poems are short. Wreck of the Deutschland is an exception. Listeners, do not begin with Wreck of the Deutschland. That's like Hopkins advanced. Don't start with it. Start with something shorter. So one of his sonnets, something simpler like Pied Beauty. That's a good one. It's relatively simple and straightforward. Start with that and read it slowly. one of the things that's nice about Hopkins's poetry is that it really forces you to slow down because you can't rush through it. Forces you to be more meditative, forces you to think about the language, which is fantastic. Here, let me actually, I'm gonna read you a poem. I'll read you Pied Beauty because I just mentioned it. Because the other thing about Hopkins's poetry is that it really helps to hear it. It's a very auditory poetry. So Pied Beauty is one of his more cheerful poems. It's a good place to start. And pied, P-I-E-D, pied means multicolored. That's one of the things I have in my annotations. So multicolored beauty, particularly sort of two color. So here's Pied Beauty. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color as a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire-cold chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscape plotted in peace, fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim. He fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him. So we read this poem. So it's a celebration of beauty in God's creation. And particularly, it's not a generic celebration of beauty. Hopkins is zeroing in on the beauty of things that are multicolored and, and therefore unexpected in their beauty. So if we go back and we look at some of his word choice, I mean, glory be to God. So he's starting with praise for dappled things, okay, for skies of couple color, so for multicolored skies. So he's picturing maybe sky with clouds. For skies as multicolored as a brinded cow, as a cow that's multicolored. Okay, that's sort of a surprising image. How beautiful is a cow? But hey, okay. For rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim. So he's looking at again trout in these little brooks that have these sort of red rose-colored dots on them, and all in stipple. Stipple is a really interesting word choice because it's a technique of painting where you have really tiny little dots. So again, that attention to detail. Fresh fire cold chestnut falls. So he's thinking about roasting chestnuts in an open fire. Not that we do that a lot lately. Finch's wings, little birds. And then he moves to something more human, landscape plotted and pieced. Now, if you've ever seen the landscape of England, the farmlands, they're very much they're in like checkerboards. You have the hedges running through it. If you fly over in a plane, which Hopkins never would have done, but he could have been on a hilltop looking down. It's like looking at a quilt. It is landscape plotted and pieced. Fold, fallow, and plow. And then he closes that stanza with all trades, their gear and tackle and trim. So he starts with sort of praising how beautiful creation is and its diversity. And he ends that stanza with thinking about, yeah, ordinary trades like plumbers and farmers and whatnot. Their gear, their equipment is very varied, and how beautiful that is. So all of that we get from slowing down, from reading the poem sort of more mindfully, not rushing through it, but sort of going through it gently and really paying attention to his word choices. And that's one of the things that Hopkins is actually brilliant at.
Yes, that's a wonderful analysis. And I noticed too that Pied Beauty is a Petrarchan sonnet, which is one of the two main sonnet forms. The other is Shakespearean. And
Mhm.
he has a very unique treatment of the sonnet, the Petrarchan form in general. So tell me more about how that form is transformed or transfixed in his hands.
Well, well, actually, Pied Beauty is a specific thing he did. It's what he calls a
Oh, okay.
curtal sonnet,
Uh,
where he takes the regular sonnet form and he sort of shrinks it.
mm,
So he takes the same proportions as a sonnet, but he just makes them a little bit smaller. So it's a little bit shorter, a little bit more condensed. So a sonnet, for those in the audience who know what the sonnet is, a kind of poem. Sonnets are a very not say rigid, but a very structured form. 14 lines, and there's a specific pattern to it. And there's different sort of ways that the rhymes can work out. The two typical ones are the English and the Italian, also called the Shakespearean and the Petrarchan. And they have different forms. So the Shakespearean sonnet, or English sonnet, has a certain rhyme scheme and ends with a closing couplet, so the last two lines rhyme. Whereas the Italian or Petrarchan sonnet has a form that kind of falls into two halves. There's approximately one slightly larger than the other. So sonnets have as a device what's called a turn, which happens either at the that couplet for an English sonnet, or it happens at line 9 in an Italian sonnet. And this turn is where the sonnet makes some sort of movement thematically. There's some sort of shift in the narrative. There's maybe a contrast or a development or a question answer. And so that's something that Hopkins does a lot with. He does use, as you noted correctly, the Italian form rather than the English form. I think it gives him more room to develop the two different parts of his sonnet structure. And he does some interesting things with line length, for instance, and where it breaks. It's a little bit too detailed to get into in a conversation, but he's definitely a master of the sonnet form.
Yes. And in the particular poem that you've read, Pied Beauty, the turn occurred in the line, all things counter, original, spare, strange.
Yes, because you're kind of shifting. You've got the specifics. You've got the first stanza is lots of specific details, and then the second stanza, which he now kind of sums up. So we had that first stanza. He's naming all these different things: cows, trout, finches, landscape, tradesmen's tools. Then there's the turn where he's now kind of assessing it. All things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how. So here he's kind of stepping back and saying all these things that are different, that are distinctive. And then a wonderful line where he now, instead of giving us nouns, he's giving us adjectives, and he's pairing off adjectives with pairs of contrasts: swift, slow, sweet, sour, a dazzle, dim. And then he comes back to that sort of, it's because really this is a doxology, it's a poem of praise. He comes back to started with glory be to God. Now he comes back with, he fathers forth whose beauty is past change, praise him. So we have all this reflection on beauty that is changing, that is varied, and coming back to it all comes from God, who is past change, who is unchanging, but it all comes from him. So it's a marvelous, marvelous poem, and that you see that movement, that development of the theme in it.
Mhm. Yes. Tell me more about how God is depicted in the poems of Hopkins.
Well, I wouldn't say so much that he's depicted as that Hopkins's faith is such a fundamental part of who he is, that it's part of what he's working with. So some of his poems are explicitly religious. Some of them are not. Pied Beauty is. Many of them, I would say, are very distinctively Christian. And one of the things I think that's notable about Hopkins's poems is that when he's addressing God, he's not afraid to kind of be challenging and very forthright, and especially in the sonnets that are called the sonnets of desolation, or the terrible sonnets, where he's really grappling with bleak themes, with the experience of depression, with sadness and loss. I mean, he really is absolutely laying it out there. Um, and he's addressing God, not holding anything back. And I think this is interesting because it really shows the strength of Hopkins's faith, because he knows God can take it. There's nothing he can say that's going to offend God. There's nothing he can say that's going to shock him if he's complaining or lamenting. And so there's always this sense of a bedrock faith underneath it, which frees him to be completely honest in addressing the Lord. Um, and there's a beautiful poem, Thou art indeed just, Lord, where he's actually taking a meditation on Jeremiah 12:1. And it's worth noting sometimes people who are looking at these poems where Hopkins is expressing frustration or sadness or depression, and they do a strictly sort of biographical reading and say, well, he must have been clinically depressed because he wrote these poems. Um, it seems pretty clear that Hopkins did suffer from depression. He just had an emotionally rough ride through his life, but I don't think we can do a straight assumption that that's where these poems are all coming from, because while he's writing them, his life is not totally bleak. He's carrying on correspondences with friends, so he's aware that he has a support network even while he's lamenting. Not that that means he doesn't feel depressed and lonely at times, but there's also some very strong indications that he's deliberately exploring these themes. So, for instance, Thou art indeed just, Lord, is a meditation on some lines of scripture that, in fact, give the lament that he starts with. So he didn't invent this; he's taking it from the Bible. And there's another poem um, um, where he's giving sort of the experience of what it's like to be a damned soul, which seems like pretty crushing depression. But then you realize, when I looked into this, that he wrote this partly in response to doing some of the spiritual exercises of Saint Ignatius. That's what they used in the Jesuit order for their spiritual formation. And one of those exercises is to put yourself in the place imaginatively of a soul who is, heading to hell, so that you can have empathy, and so you can say, well, I'm not going to choose I'm not going to choose that route. No, no, no. So he's doing this as a kind of spiritual exercise. It's not necessarily reportage from his own experiences. He had a very powerful imagination. So with that said, let me read you Thou art indeed just, Lord, which is one of his great sonnets of lament. Thou art indeed just, Lord, if I contend with thee. But, sir, so what I plead is just. Why do sinners' ways prosper? And why must disappointment all I endeavor end? And that's, by the way, that bit is basically a poetic translation of the line from Jeremiah. So he's starting off with this quote. So there's that I, but he's reflecting on this scriptural starting point. So he says, why do sinners' ways prosper? And why must disappointment all I endeavor end? Here he's doing that reversal of syntax. Why must everything I endeavor to do end in disappointment? And now here we hear him speaking to God very forthrightly. Wert thou my enemy, O thou my friend, how wouldst thou worse, I wonder, than thou dost, defeat, thwart me? Again, his syntax, which I unpack in my annotations, he's saying, okay, God, you're my friend, but if you were my enemy, could you possibly be any worse to me? Could you possibly defeat me and thwart me and any worse than you do now, you who are my friend? That's a pretty direct thing to be saying to God. Oh, the sots and thralls of lust do in spare hours more thrive than I that spends her life upon thy cause. Look at these drunkards and lechers who in their free time are more successful than I am, who've given my whole life to the work I'm doing for you. See banks and breaks, now leave it how thick, laced they are again with fretty chervil. Look, and fresh wind shakes them. He's looking at the hedges. Look, birds build, but not I build. So he's looking at the birds building nests in a hedge. He says, birds build, but not I build. No, but strain, time's eunuch, and not breed one work that wakes. Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain. What a poem. So he's moving through this lament because he's looking around at his life and saying, "What have I done that is any good?" And of course, in his own life, he could look at the fact that he wasn't a terribly good preacher. He was more successful pastorally than a lot of people give him credit for. But he was a high achiever, and so I think he saw this is not what I could be living up to. Okay, he's a professor, he's grading all these papers, it's fine, but he's not really accomplishing much, he thinks. And he doesn't have his poetry published, partly because he hasn't really been making a whole lot of effort to do it. But he's looking at this and saying, "Oh, I'm not building." And he calls himself Time's eunuch. Eunuch, a man who has been castrated, so literally unfruitful. Um, and here we want to remember that as a Catholic priest, he is vowed to celibacy, a vow that he was faithful to. So he's aware as part of what he's given up that he's not going to marry, he's not going to have children, he's going to remain chaste his entire life, is celibate. So what about his artistic life? What about his fruitfulness in literature? But he says, I strain time's eunuch and not breed one work that wakes. So here, I think he's expressing very beautifully the lament of the artist, or any teacher or anyone who's saying, what am I doing that's going to live beyond me? Is there anything that is going to wake up into life, whether it's a poem or a student that I inspire? Um, so he's expressing this frustration that I think partly drawn from experience, but profoundly rooted in human nature. Because how many of us have felt that kind of anxiety, that like, what am I doing that's going to last? And I think what makes this really such a powerful poem is that he's so forthright in speaking to God. He says, "You're just, but what I plead is just. Hear me out. And if you were my enemy, how could you be worse to me than you are now?" It's pretty straight talk. But then he concludes with this lovely prayer. He says, addresses God as, "O thou Lord of life. O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain." So now he's putting himself to be like those hedges. And he says, "Give me rain to my roots so that I can flourish, so that I can bloom." And of course, it's an absolutely trusting prayer because he trusts that God will do that. So we have that movement from sort of angst to petition, and it's all based in a really fundamental emotional, spiritual honesty, and such a vivid language. So this is the kind of thing that makes Hopkins just a really great poet.
Oh yes, yes. And I think he has helped me a lot in, my journey in learning how to pray too, because as a newfangled Catholic, I learned that, you pray for somebody other than yourself. You pray to give thanks, and you also pray to ask something either of yourself or of somebody else. But Hopkins, he seems to lay it all out there. He's angry, sad, frustrated. He brings it to the Lord.
Yeah, and I think that's why I think one of the reasons his poems are so spiritually helpful. One can pray through them or with them. Because again, remember, Hopkins was a priest, so he was also preaching, and he was teaching. And I think although his poems are not didactic in the sense he's not trying to convey a message, I think he is still conveying that through what he's saying in the poem. And I think there's so much we can learn. Let me read you one more. I won't go into much detail, but there's a marvelous poem. Patience. Patience is a great poem. There's so many great poems. See, or do we want to do peace? Hold on one second. Patience and peace both are both really important poems. Maybe I'll read them both. So in both of these are poems in which Hopkins is really kind of wrestling with his own spiritual life. And so there, that that we or that I invites the reader to come in and kind of share that experience with him. So talking about the experience of prayer, the very first line of patience is patience, the hard thing, but to pray, but bid for patience is. So we have right away Hopkins basically saying, I know I need to be patient, but I want it now. It's hard to be patient and it's hard to pray. But bid for patiences, patience who asks, wants war, wants wounds, weary his times, his tasks, to do without, take tosses and obey. So he's starting to saying, well, I want to do big things. I want to have my faith challenge the big things, war and fighting, but instead weary his times, his tasks, to do without, take tosses and obey. How boring, right? This is not the exciting way to have a spiritual life. Rare patience roots in these, and these away nothing, nowhere. Natural heart's ivy, patience masks our ruins of wrecked past purpose. There she basks, purple eyes and seas of liquid leaves all day. It's a beautiful image of ivy covering over a broken building. So patience, it slowly grows, covers all this with green. We hear our hearts grate on themselves. It kills to bruise them dearer. Yet the rebellious wills of us, we do bid God bend to him even so. And where is he who more and more distills delicious kindness? He is patient. Patience fills his crisp combs, and that comes the ways we know. So he's acknowledging how hard it is to pray for patience, how hard it is to accept the ordinary just bumps and bruises of life. He says we hear our hearts grate on themselves, and yet he says the rebellious wills of us, we do bid God bend to him even so. And I love that image because he's aware that his will is rebellious, but at the same time, he's willing to be obedient. So it's not like an all or nothing thing. Oh, now I'm obedient. I'm just going to trust in God. The rebellious wills of us, we do bid God bend to him even so. We're asking God to help us be more willing to let God work in us. And then he closes again with that kind of affirmation of sort of the end result. Patience fills his crisp combs. These are honeycombs. We have this image of patience as a kind of honey. You know, bees bring it little by little, they bring the pollen and makes the honey very slow. Patience fills his crisp combs, and that comes the ways we know. Yeah, we know how this works. We want to rush it. We want to rush it, but we know. We know we just have to wait and pray. So that's whole meditation of patience is such a wonderful working through of, I want to be patient, Lord, I want to be patient right now. Oh, that's kind of silly. Let me slow down and let God kind of work in me. So now let me just read let me read Peace, and not, I think we're running a little bit out of time. So Peace is a lovely poem. I'll read the whole thing straight through, but first, I want to say this connects up to patience because he's working through patience. He's working through, I want to learn to be patient. And now he's asking, am I ever going to feel at peace? Am I ever going to feel really contented? And he pictures peace as a kind of bird that's sort of fluttering around but won't land. So peace as a dove. And again, remember that the dove is an image of the Holy Spirit. So I'm going to read the whole thing straight through. When will you ever, peace, wild wood dove, shy wings shut, your round me roaming end and under be my boughs? When, peace, will you, peace? I'll not play hypocrite to own my heart. I yield you do come sometimes, but that piecemeal peace is poor peace. What pure peace allows alarms of wars, the daunting wars, the death of it? Oh, surely, reaving peace, my lord should leave in lieu some good. And so he does leave patience exquisite, that plumes to peace thereafter. And when peace here does house, he comes with work to do. He does not come to coo, he comes to brood and sit. What a marvelous poem. This idea connecting up to patience, that he wants peace. Where is peace? Why does peace come and go? And then he recognizes that, okay, when peace is not here, the Lord is leaving me the opportunity to cultivate patience, patience exquisite that grows into peace. And then he recognizes that when the Holy Spirit comes, he comes with work to do. He does not come to coo, to make these sort of nice noises. He comes to brood and to sit on like brood is what birds do when they're sitting on a nest. They're going to hatch eggs. So what a picture of promise, like that we've had these frustrations. Where is peace? Where is peace? But patience is preparing the way. And then when peace here does house, he comes with work to do. He does not come to coo. He comes to brood and sit. Oh, marvelous poem.
Yes. Yes.